And it's so funny on the book. It says the New York Times has called you the most influential public intellectual in the Western world, which is undoubtedly true. It's a tremendous amount of pressure. And do you ever say to yourself, like, do you ever look at the Western world and go, you know what? I don't want to be the most influential public intellectual. I don't want to be responsible in any way for what's going on.
Well, I would say I vary in that opinion moment to moment every day. I'm in an extremely fortunate position, but it's also a strange position, and it isn't exactly clear to me how to conceptualize it or how to move forward in the position that I'm in. So I'm actively working that through.
Do you like fame? Like, do you like the adulation of people? Because you've helped a tremendous amount of people, and you're very well known. That also comes with, obviously, a lot of negatives, but there's a ton of positives to it. And have you grown to like them, to like the idea of being famous?
Well, I find it very difficult to accustom myself to. It happened to me quite late in life, and so it's still very strange for me to walk down the street and be recognized continually. Some of it's extremely positive. It's as if I'm always among friends and well-wishers. I mean, you wouldn't get that impression if you looked at my reputation online, let's say, because there's a disproportionate number of journalists who have taken a dislike to me. But when I'm out in public, it's like living in a small town, but everywhere in some sense, but in a small town like that was this subject of a 1950s, romanticized version of a small town where everyone loves each other, and people are always telling me that they're happy to see me walking around and looking healthy, or they just say hello, or they, do a thumbs up or yell something out. And so it's like being among friends and well-wishers, except it's more intimate than that. And it's extraordinarily positive, but also very difficult to conceptualize. I was walking with a friend of mine this morning who's a clinical psychologist, and I was talking about this issue and about the impact that my communication has had culturally and at the level of individual lives. And, I mentioned to her, and we discussed the fact that so much of this isn't a consequence of my ideas. I've read widely, and I read people who were very profound thinkers. Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and Jung, people who know me know that they were great influences on me, but much more widely than that, many neuroscientists and many literary figures. And of course, people like Jung and Nietzsche and Dostoevsky were overwhelmingly influenced by their own reading and their own knowledge, their knowledge of Christianity, the knowledge of our religious traditions. In Jung's case, his psychoanalytic practice and his work with schizophrenics. And I've read much of the major works by all the major clinical psychologists, and I've been able to communicate those ideas, to synthesize them to some degree, and then to communicate them to very large numbers of people. It's not that surprising the ideas have a profound effect, because they were written by geniuses who were interested in helping people sort out their lives and live more meaningful lives. And so, on the one hand, it's not surprising that the ideas have that influence, but on the other, it's difficult, it's complex to be the person who's identified with that to such a great degree.
You're the conduit.
Yes, which is a cliched thing in some sense. Artists say that they're just a conduit, but there's truth in that. And people say that I articulate what they already know, and that's helpful. And I believe that to be the case, because otherwise it wouldn't echo and reverberate.
Right. And as powerfully as it does. One of your rules, which I looked at here in the new book, it said, and I want to ask you about this, it says, do not allow yourself to become resentful, deceitful, or arrogant. The first part of that, I've witnessed, and and I know that you've lived, and I've never seen an attack on someone like I've seen on you. And I paid attention. You know, I'm a comedian. I talk about cultural issues. I am relatively well versed in what's going on in the public sphere. I've never seen attempt after attempt after attempt to smear and like besmirch a human being as I saw with you. There was much less, and I'm serious about this. There was maybe less negative press about Osama bin Laden than you. I think there was more of like people trying to understand Osama bin Laden. He grew up, and he was disenfranchised, whatever it was. But how do you not, especially because you went through this very powerful ordeal, and I don't know how, and I know that a lot of that was internal family dynamics and your own health and your family's health, but how do you not become resentful against the people that have tried to assassinate your character? Also, do you blame any of them for what you went through recently, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but the ordeal that you went through? Do you blame any of these people? Do you say to yourself, had they not been as aggressive and had they not been as vicious, you might not have been in the situation you were in?
Well, I worked through a lot of the answers to the questions that you're asking while I was writing this second book. The last chapter, the chapter you referred to, do not become resentful, deceitful, or arrogant. Those are the three things that I noticed that were particularly catastrophic to people in my clinical practice. Those three things and their interactions. And then in the final chapter, chapter 12, is be grateful in spite of your suffering. Look, the first thing I'd say is that I've watched people since I've become a public figure. I've watched people, my peers, let's say academics in other places in the world, or people who are roughly my professional peers, who've been the target of attacks on Twitter or in the newspapers in some manner similar to what's happened to me. And my observation has been that it's very, very hard on people. They generally fold up and apologize and are shocked and hurt to a quite deep degree. And so it's no joke to have that happen to you. It's given me more insight into why people are so likely to not say the things they need to say when it's the time to say them, because the trouble that can cause is very difficult to cope with. And so I certainly wouldn't say that it's been without effect. It's also a great mystery to me that it continually happens. I continually expect it to stop, right, but it doesn't stop, and it's hard to understand why that is exactly. I'm trying to understand that all the time. I think to some degree, there's a public attempt to understand that even. And I say that because I'm also the subject of an inordinate number of memes. Right. And they represent who people think I am in a very large number of ways, strange ways. I've become very associated with lobster imagery and with frog imagery and with king imagery and with, well, the Red Skull imagery. And it's a very complex set of images. And so that all adds to the difficulty of sorting it out as far as I'm concerned. I certainly was tempted towards bitterness and resentment as a consequence of my illness, which created a tremendous amount of pain. And well, at the same time, or approximately the same time, my daughter and my wife were also very ill. And so it's difficult not to succumb to the temptation to shake your fist at God and curse the clouds and the thunder and the structure of being itself for right, all the suffering that people go through. But it's not helpful. And I've really strived, with the help primarily of my wife, but also of other people close to me, to identify resentful and bitter thoughts and to eradicate them, because they're not helpful. They're not justifiable, like under any condition, as far as I can tell. And that's why I tried to illustrate in chapter 12 that gratitude is most properly conceptualized, if it's not naive, as a form of courage. It's sort of like the decision you take when you decide to get married. You know, the trope is that you find the right person and then you just know. But the truth of the matter is that you decide, and then you continually keep deciding day after day while you're living with the person. And gratitude in the face of life suffering is the same thing. It's a decision about an attitude that you are going to strive to bring forward. It isn't so much a considered opinion about the benevolence or lack thereof of the world.
Right.
So, and I just couldn't see when I delved into my thoughts. I thought, this seems unfair. My family is struggling under a tremendous burden of ill health. Not that that's not true of many, many families. I'm very aware of that. And at the same time, this, in some sense, rather unique exposure to continual public pillorying, if that's a word, and probably isn't. But when I delved into it, identified all the thoughts and thought them through, I couldn't see any positive utility. They weren't helping me in any way. So, and I've done a reasonable job of dispensing with them in the last 2 months. I would say at the same time, however, I've also been recovering to a fair degree since I've been properly diagnosed finally.
Now, what was that proper diagnosis for the people that aren't aware of what you went through? Because I know that there was a lot of speculation because there was really no information out there when you kind of disappeared from public life. Yeah.
It's still not exactly clear what happened to me. I've had a long history of depression, and that definitely has played a role in predisposing me to whatever happened over the last few years. But my new physician, I was particularly suffering in the mornings. And by the end of the day, I was back to something approximating normal, but it would take me like 8 hours or so of real effort to even get to the point where I could stand up and move forward without excruciating pain, without believing that I was going to collapse. And then that would recur every morning. Well, he investigated the structure of my sleep and found that I had severe central sleep apnea, and I was waking up 25 times an hour or so. And those are stressful occurrences where you stop breathing. And so I've been using a breathing machine for the last month, and it's improved me from about 5% of function to about 50 or 60%. And I'm still seem to be improving, at least to some degree. And so apparently I was wearing this ring that monitors sleep, and I was getting 0 deep sleep, maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes a night, which is nowhere near enough.
No.
And since I've been using the machine, it's up to more like 30 to 50 minutes. That's where your body restores itself completely, is during deep sleep. And so at least one of the problems that I was facing, it's not the only one, but at least one of them was chronic lack of sleep.
And I know that you had anxiety, and then you were having bouts of anxiety. You had your wife's illness and Michaela's surgery, and you're having bouts of anxiety, and then you're taking, a doctor prescribed benzodiazepines to try to deal with that, and you keep upping the dosage of that, and then you're having an atypical reaction to the medication, where you're having
both to the medication. Yeah, well, I started taking it in 2017. I had a pronounced episode of insomnia, and it lasted for a long time, about 3 weeks. I had very little sleep. People have, I said, I think on Joe Rogan, that I didn't sleep for 21 days. And the cynics have pointed out that the world record for sleeplessness is 11 days. But there's a big difference between trying to stay awake, which is what you're doing when you're trying to break a record, and being unable to sleep. Those aren't the same thing at all. And perhaps I was micro-sleeping when I was laying down, but my subjective experience was 3 weeks without any sleep at all. I went to talk to, and I had all sorts of other symptoms that were quite mysterious. I would faint when I stood up, and chronically, and I was ice cold. I couldn't get warm no matter how many blankets I piled on.
Was this,
among other
any
symptoms,
of this had to do with your
stress?
Well, stress, certainly, but like you start these medications in 2017. Had these things happened prior to you taking the medications?
Well, it's complicated because I had a history of depression as well. And I stopped taking antidepressants in early 2016. And that seemed to be going quite well. But and I have an autoimmune disorder. So
and what is that?
It's complicated.
Is it like an autoimmune disorder is just, I know that, examples of that are like lupus or something like that. What type of disorder is it? I know that your diet.
Well, I haven't had arthritic symptoms, but I had psoriasis quite marked, and chronic history of mouth ulcers and peripheral uveitis in my right eye, which is an inflammatory condition in the retina. And I had I can't remember the name of it. It's your hair follicles are attacked by your immune system, and sometimes people go completely bald. They lose all their hair. I don't remember the name. Alopecia.
Yes,
I had alopecia as well.
And is this why you have the diet that you have? Because I remember you said that the diet you have has alleviated some of those symptoms.
Yeah, well, both my wife and I have autoimmune problems, and so does my daughter, although my son doesn't. And my daughter's very severe arthritis was ameliorated to a tremendous degree by a meat-only diet, which she's maintained for 5 years. And so both my wife and I, while we're still on that diet, both of us are still on that diet, which I wouldn't casually recommend to anyone, by the way. It's very restrictive. It's very hard on my social life. It makes it very difficult to travel or to go out. But it does seem to keep these symptoms essentially under control.
Now, were you diagnosed when you and your wife, you both have this disorder? Do you have similar disorders, or is her disorder?
Hers is more severe
than
mine.
And you were diagnosed with that when you were younger, or did that come on later in life?
Well, it was diagnosed mostly this year.
Okay.
I mean, these other sort of symptomatic conditions,
sure,
uveitis, and so on, they were diagnosed as they arose. But this year, I was subject to a lot of medical tests, and I had various blood markers of autoimmune trouble.